Morning, everybody. How we doing today? Uh, it's a Thursday morning here in the upper Midwest of America, Minnesota. Living an hour from the city, south near the city of Rochester, Minnesota, a big medical center. Mayo is a famous worldwide hospital and research facility. Uh, it's a nice area. It's got a little bit of sprinkled winter mixed in the rain today, a little snow coming with it, but that's part of being in Minnesota. So today we're going to talk about uh, Tipping the Scales, the new tone poem by Jackie Mclean. I just want to touch on a few things first. I think one of the things people forget about jazz is how much it was a music of fun, of popularity, of dancing, of good times, communal behavior. There's a link to today's music in jazz that a lot of people don't seem to recognize. If you talk about like house remixes, the most popular house remixes are simply dance versions of the big hits of the day. A lot of songs in their initial context aren't danceable. But if someone can come along and put a remix behind them, put a beat behind it, make it danceable, sometimes that remix will chart higher than the original. It's a pretty common thing. And most of the most popular house, techno, electronic dance music songs out there are generally kind of remixes of pretty famous artists' songs. So there's a familiarity with that song that's going to allow people to enjoy it, but it's also got that danceability so that people can get out there on the floor and mingle. And then if you go back to the disco era, well, that same thing was happening there. They were taking popular songs often and remixing them to be danceable. It was a pretty common thing. You even had people remixing Mozart, fit the Beethoven. Like, it wasn't Mozart, Beethoven, sorry. So it was a pretty common thing to have a dance disco remix of something. And a lot of people kind of made their own kind of cheesy remixes, like bands like Kiss. The fact that Kiss made I Was Made for Loving You, this disco song, is all you really ever need to know about Kiss. And it's why they're not one of the greatest rock and roll bands of all time. And as much of an institution as they are in a lot of ways, they were always kind of a fabricated money-making machine where the music always felt secondary to me. Never felt that important. Never felt like there was that much attention or detail or integrity or soul put into that music. It felt very much calculated and preconceived and lacking genuine. That's just my feeling on it. But jazz played that same role in the early days, up into the swing days for sure. They were remixing popular songs. And they were really doing two things in those days. They were either playing something that was kind of rhythm in the blues, or they were borrowing often from the American songbook, the great songwriters from Tin Pan Alley and the Broadway shows and the Hollywood films. And they were remixing that stuff to make it danceable. And so there's this link between dance and fun and good time that's still present today. And that's one of the things that jazz was doing in those days. And I don't think these black men who were doing this were setting out to make a new form of music necessarily. I think they just wanted to make something that was how they would do it. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, that's kind of a cool melody. What if we put a little swing behind that? You know what I mean? Put a little groove into it. We'll give it some space. We'll let some guys improvise. I think it's this natural evolution of, in some ways, making it something that the black community can dig. And I think that's something that kind of happens even in the disco and even in the modern era today. And of course, a lot of those electronic remixes today are for all the college kids and all the downtown clubs across the country and college. You know what I mean? They want to hear all those remixes of Rihanna and whatever you got. Some of them are great, some of them are awful. I like some of the Justin Timberlake remixes I got quite a lot, but there's a lot of really cheesy remixes out there. And disco obviously got the same thing, and jazz probably was guilty of that a lot as well. And that's probably why guys like Charlie Parker got a little bored with it and started pushing the envelope. And I mentioned Parker here because And the opening refrain of this record, Tipping the Scales, I feel like you get some elements of Jackie McLean still sounding like Charlie Parker. And he truly was one of the Parker disciples out there. You know, Sonny Stitt was accused of it. A lot of the great alto players of the time were, and almost all saxophonists on some level were guilty of borrowing from Parker, as were most jazz musicians. But being on alto, it was the easiest connection and leap to make. And for my sake, for my interest, for my liking, I like Jackie best when he is emulating Parker, because it seems to make his tonality rounder and more melodic and sweet. And I feel like when he edges towards the avant-garde and the new thing and the 60s sounds, it opens the door for him being more sour. And I'm not sure how documented this is. I don't know if he's ever acknowledged this, but people say that he set his horns mouthpiece so that he was always a little sharp, which I sense it and feel it. It's always a little edgy, always a little bit of hint of dissonance in there. And on the second track on this record, there's just some notes that are just so sour, so edgy, and without there being a second horn player here to mitigate that, those notes really just kind of hang there in the air like sour milk. And a couple of them sound almost flat to me, not sharp, but I guess that can go either way. Sharp can sound flat, just in the opposite direction. But once again, Kevin Gray and company have done a wonderful job. Beautiful packaging. Beautiful photographs. Once again, we have Sonny Clark here. And unlike a lot of that late 50s Sonny Clark, this was in 62 when Clark has returned to Blue Note. And upon his return, he makes Leapin' and Lopin', and he starts doing some style work again. Sadly, he passes away not long after that. But as I've said before, Sonny Clark is such an institution of the Blue Note sound of the late 50s, and it's really sad that we don't really get to see the direction that Sonny Clark would have gone. Because I don't think he would have gone Cecil Taylor in any way, and I think he might have borrowed some from Monk, but of course he had his own passions and fuel that fired him. And I would have liked to see where Sonny Clark had went into the mid-60s and late 60s. I think he'd have been a really interesting player. Somewhere in between a Bobby Timmons and maybe some of what Monk was doing. Because he always has some angles and edges to him. But just a wonderful, percussive, there's an angry delicacy to Sonny Clark. That's the best way I can put him, an angry delicacy. He's tickling the ivories, but there's a propulsion and a intensity and a fire that's being fueled by his emotional state and his how he feels about being in America at this time and place. So Clark's always a very important figure. Again, you have Butch Warren on the bass, pretty young man at this point, and the great Arthur Taylor on the drums. So a nice rhythm section. And again, Kevin Gray, just fantastic packaging. I got a little seam split here in the mail from where the record fit in there. But again, I'm not complaining about that. However, this new round of Tone Poets, this one did cost like $40 on Amazon, and they were 28, 27, so I don't know why this new batch has become so expensive. There's a Hank Mobley curtain call showing up in a week or so, and that one was also about $40. So it's disappointing that the prices jumped so quickly on these from the very affordable $26, $28, $29 that they were to now in the $40 range plus shipping, which on Amazon you sometimes get away with that, but still lovely packaging, lovely design. And that leads me to my next point here. This record does have an original sequence number 4427. It says 84427. That just signifies it's stereo pressing. By this point, 62, I think most of their stuff was, they're probably still doing mono. But this is the original version or release of Jackie McLean Tipping Scales. And this is a great example of graphic design in jazz, how much it just bottoms out. And this probably comes out in 80. Does it say here when this was released? 84 looks like. There might be a Japanese version of this also, but this has like a grainy black and white, almost from a newspaper looking photograph. It's not even very clear. Everything just looks secondhand, low budget, unimportant. It just feels like it's unimportant, like it's the back pages of the newspaper. And that's one of the sad things I think about graphic design and jazz in general by the 80s. And really in the 70s is where it starts going to shit. And with Blue Note in particular, immediately after the sale, they started making awful album covers. The Liberty design team just didn't have that same concern and oversight, and a lot of crap was made on the Blue Note album covers. The second Liberty took over from Alfred and Frank, which I've illustrated that in some episodes before, just showing people how different it is. But by the 70s, across the world, jazz record covers are just cheap and single toned, bad fonts, bad graphics. It's just such an afterthought. And I'm sure some of that's because jazz sales plummet so greatly that you don't really have a jazz marketing department or a jazz graphic design department. So it all feels very much an afterthought. The one exception would be CTI in the 70s. They were doing outstanding album covers in the 70s. But why that didn't cross over into other aspects of jazz in the 70s and 80s, it's really a mystery to me. This is just an awful, awful, banal, awful looking album cover. The colors don't pop. Everything just looks like I photocopied it. So again, there was no reason why they couldn't be doing the Reed Miles type covers in this point. They just didn't. And they went for, there's color on this. That's kind of a navy and that's kind of a green. So they obviously could have done a nice colored cover. But records in the 80s, it's just a shame how many bad record covers. It's true because it's why I don't have a lot of 80s jazz records. They just don't appeal to me looking at them. Like, it looks, I'll never play that. Those great covers are part of what you want to pull out and just absorb, and you want to smell that church basement, the mildew, and I love that scent of my mom's grandma's basement kind of thing. You know, and you don't get that in the 80s. It's just such a bad time for jazz graphic design. So anyway, this record was released initially in '62 when it was recorded. I think part of it is Mclean. He's a bit hit or miss at times. I'm going to be honest, some of his playing on this record, I'm not a huge fan of. I think Sonny Clark more than makes up for it, and he's always worth the price of admission. Why this one jumped so dramatically in price, it's a bit of a mystery to me. Maybe it's just got to do with the record pressing plants, and the demand is making the price increase, which that's kind of how this whole system operates. I'm going to show you something here. There's just places here where it kind of weakens. There's just some missed notes in there. It's he looks high on the cover, which obviously he had a bad drug problem for years. It's right here. It's sour. It's not centered. And whether that's by design or just a lazy player that's high, or by maybe it's intentional. Maybe he just wants to create that dissonance. It's not even dissonance in a Mingus or Monk sense where it feels very angled intentionally. It just feels like a musician that's kind of feeling his way but not quite finding it, to me. And I played a lot of guitar players when I was a rock drummer, an R&B drummer. When you play with a musician that doesn't quite have, and it's not like McLean's not a great musician. He is. He was an educator for a long time, so he knows his stuff. But I find this is true with a lot of Mclean's work. It's just, he seems to be in his own world at times. He seems to be in his own head, discussing and arguing with himself about where he wants to go. And I find Miles Davis has some of that same quandary at times, where there's a debate in his own mind about, does he want to do the sweet thing or does he want to do the sour thing? And he ends up kind of slurring his way to one or the other, almost indecisively. And I get that from Jackie as well. I do think on the positive side of things, Jackie is one of those guys that gives us some idea where Parker would have gone. I think Parker into the 60s would have been a wonderful thing to have had. I think he would have been a very strong proponent of some of the changes that were happening, and you would have been able to interpret them in such a wonderful. I think this goes for Clifford Brown too. I think if Clifford and Bird had both seen the avant-garde, the new thing, all that starting to take place, or not Coleman's free stuff in 58, 59, 60, as that was starting to take root, I think we would have gotten some of the greatest examples of those innovations being brought to light by some of the greatest players ever, but moderating them with their experience and their wisdom, their knowledge and know-how, how things were done before. I think sometimes young kids come up with some new ideas, but they don't have the context of what came before to balance it. So I think Parker and Brownie would have both been a fantastic looking glass into those new sounds had they stuck around. And so you're left guessing where they would have gone. And players like Hubbard and Lee Morgan give you some idea where Clifford Brown would have gone. And I think guys like Jackie Mclean, to some degree, are going to inform us where Bird would have gone. And you could never really know. By the time Bird was in the early to mid 50s, he's recording fairly middle of the road stuff for Norman Granz at Verve, April in Paris type stuff. That was kind of sweet, and he loved good songs and good melodies. They're quite accessible records. They're certainly not the innovative pushing of an early bebop back in the days of Coco and in the mid 40s when he was working for Dial and Savoy and those type of labels. He was in a different headspace then. And I think some of it might be just the drugs and the alcohol taking their toll. He's not as chomping at the bit to get out the gate. Some of it I think was Norman Granz's tutelage, Norman Granz's opportunity saying, I'll record you, I'll give you a steady paycheck, but we need to keep you somewhat within an accessible framework. And we want your legacy to be strong. You're one of the greats of all time. And Verve probably has half of his best sounding recordings. And they don't have some of the dimensions of the bebop necessarily that he was doing in the 40s. He's playing more in the roots of the blues and the gospel and the American songbook. He's still throwing some amazing dexterous things in there. Just like Clifford Brown and strings, both of them can be in the middle of the most saccharine arrangement, but give you some of the most vivacious and full of life things. And so Mclean is a bridge. He is a moment in time that he's connected to Parker. He's connected to bebop. He comes up very much in that school. And he's never really hard bop in the same sense as the Morgans and the Mobleys and the Donald Byrds and some of those guys. He kind of is always leaning to expanding the sound. And he has a pretty consistent catalog at Blue Note in the 60s of experimental side of jazz at that point. And as the changes become more and more interwoven into the fabric of jazz across the industry, Blue Note probably gives them a little bit more room each year as those changes are taking foot. Blue Note saying, okay, we'll allow a little bit more. Because Blue Note was also a little bit more conservative in terms of how much we're going to allow dissonance and cacophony and the crazy that so many people think jazz is. Blue Note was very hesitant to let a lot of that stuff in. And there's records that were made, like Pithecanthus erectus by Charlie Mingus. Blue Note would never have touched that in 56. They probably wouldn't have touched it in 1960. They probably would have taken Blue Note to about 64 where they said, okay, well, let someone do that record. Pretty conservative. Ornette Coleman's, he's doing stuff for Atlantic and Contemporary Records that I don't think Blue Note would have touched in 58, 59, 60. They might have said by 60, 61, 62. Again, you also have to factor in that if Coleman isn't doing it at Atlantic and Contemporary, those changes haven't really taken place, perhaps. And so those changes have to happen somewhere for a label like Blue Note to slowly start accepting them. But they do, by 64, 65, start making records like Eric Dolphy Out to Lunch and Grasha Montcourt. There's some fantastic out jazz to come from Blue Note, but they were, like I said, they were very hesitant. And Mclean was kind of always that guy chomping at the bit, wanting to reinvent things and to be cutting edge. And I think that's why a lot of Mclean's sessions got sat on by Blue Note. He's one of those guys where there's quite a few sessions that didn't come out till after, much later on, after he passed. The Japanese released him in the 70s and 80s. He's one of those guys that has quite a few titles that weren't issued when they were recorded. Probably almost as much as anybody. Jackie McLean stuff was sat on. And I'm guessing it's in part because of passages like what I showed you, where there's just these moments of sour, the rhythmic pulse kind of almost fades a little bit. His ideas kind of run out of energy, run out of air, run out of fuel. You know, a guy like Coltrane seemed to have circular breathing. He could just go. Most of us mortals need to breathe at times. So McLean's a very interesting point in jazz. And I find that mostly avant-garde, new thing, free jazz fans love Jackie McLean. And I find that for most people who are more rooted in the blues and the center of the road, find Jackie to be a difficult listen at times. So knowing where you're at with all that should help inform you in some way if this is a record you want to dive into. Again, the price has gone up, which to me sours the need for this on some level. Sorry, guys, but like suddenly $40, a record that at 25 is definitely, you should have this. It's a great piece, timepiece. At $40, now you're saying, well, there's probably better Jackie McLeans to have if you don't have them. And I also want to say this here, and I've said it before, but all these record store day jazz releases, the lion's share of them aren't canon. They're not necessary. A lot of them are very underqualified for being put out there as part of an artist's discography. And they're being championed and marketed to the point where everyone thinks, oh, I think I'm getting this new Monk or this new Coltrane or this new whoever it is. And a lot of that stuff was not released for a reason. A lot of it was sat on for a reason. Sometimes it was just economics of things. But other times it was takes that musicians weren't happy with. Sometimes it's the engineer producer who wasn't happy with certain sounds, or there was like, a mic fell. There's different reasons. But a lot of times it was the musicians themselves who said, I want to retake those tracks. I'm not happy with how that came out. And when you're dealing with improvisation, there's times where you're starting off in the morning recording and you're not quite there yet. So a lackluster track comes out. A lackluster session can be released. Or not released, but recorded. And as you listen to the tapes back, you're like, we can definitely play those songs with more energy. We were on fire right there. So it's an interesting piece. And because of the Sonny Clark being on it, it's definitely of note. And he's always going to add a spiritual, social, conscious element to his work that speaks for the Black community and civil rights and charged political agenda. Like Clark's just in that place. Even here by 62, you still feel it, even though he's definitely more strung out. And my guess is Jackie and him were both pretty high at this recording session. I don't know that for a fact. I don't know exactly when Jackie went through his periods of sobriety. But I think Jackie, if I remember, struggled with drugs into the 70s. So that's something else that a guy like Alfred might have sensed and been like, you guys are probably a little bit too messed up today. But that's also part of the puzzle. That's also part of the magic And sometimes you have to have a session where it gives you a spectrum. So it may not be the best session by all players, but it gives you an idea of what they sounded like when they were messed up and not focused. Or, and not saying that's this record. I'm just saying at times Mclean's a little bit dour, a little bit melodically resistant. And there's certain players you'll listen to that would never put you in that sour milk. And Mclean's the guy who's often going to put you in sour milk. And maybe the cereal you're eating has enough sugar in it to offset that. And that's what Sonny Clark is kind of here. He's kind of that, he'll give you some melodic, syrupy to sweeten it. Because Clark's always very centered. And again, the piano doesn't give you that same ability to kind of miss a note, just be a little flat or sharp or whatever. A piano, you kind of hit the key and that's the note you get, unless the piano's out of tune. So again, the rhythm section is great. You know, they just plunder along. Butch Warren's a fantastic player, as is Arthur Taylor, of course. And I'll probably just wrap this up here. I think Tipping the Scales, the title track, is probably the shiningest piece on here. 2 for 1's nice. Nicely's a good track. The second track was my least favorite. That Rainy Blues, oddly enough, which sounds like a song I would love, title-wise. So, again, great stuff. It's quality Blue Note in most senses here. And it will give you a link between that center-of-the-road Blue Note sound and some of the edges that are going to come and are starting to come and show up already at Blue Note. Imperial Isles by Herbie Hancock's on the horizon. You know, Bobby Hutcherson's going to show up here shortly. And his early records are kind of more middle of the road as well, but he starts to really push things out with some of the groups he puts together. What's his name? Tip of my tongue. Ian Hill? No, not Ian Hill. Oh my God. Andrew Hill. Sorry. Ian Hill, bass player for Judas Priest. Not the same as Andrew Hill, who comes to Blue Note probably 63 and releases 4 or 5 impactful records fairly quickly in succession. You got to be a big fan of Andrew Hill. And Andrew had that wonderful sense, kind of gives you an idea where Sonny Clark might have gone as well. You know, with edges and dissonance and propulsion and great composition. Hill was a pretty powerful figure that comes to Blue Note right about the time we lose Sonny Clark. So what you have with Tipping the Scales, is Blue Note allowing some transition to happen. Them not being totally happy with the product and shelving it for a while. But it's still an important note in one of the great labels in one of their prime moments. You know, Blue Note's still at the top of the game here in 62. They were cutting edge in the late 50s with the hard bop sound. And they kind of lose that cutting edge and recede back to the middle of the pack somewhat in terms of being leaders of the sound. They're still kind of stuck with hard bop, and the boogaloo thing's about to happen for them. Soul jazz is coming to the scene. Jimmy Smith's about to depart. All the organists and guitar players are about to come in. So there's a real change happening at Blue Note, trying to find commercial success and balancing with artistic endeavor. But any recording label, any artist can only be cutting edge so long before something else new comes along. So this is Blue Note kind of playing catch up a little bit. And it's not a perfect record, but it's a great record. So I'm going to leave it at that. Hope you all enjoyed that. Tone Poet, thank you for always releasing this great material. I'm looking forward to Curtain Call by Hank Mobley a lot. It's a record I don't think I've even heard before. I might have heard it on the online, like on streaming or something, but I've never had a copy of that in my hand. But looking forward to that Tone Poet Curtain Call release for probably a year since they announced it, and it was pushed back a couple times as well. So that should be here within the next couple of weeks. We'll get back to my Legacy Series records on my next episode. It's a fun little series. It's challenging a little bit in some ways, trying to think of what the most legacy enduring record by some artists are. I've had a few comments saying, let's do Clifford Brown. I'm like, okay, I'd love to. But with Clifford Brown, there's not a clear-cut record that you would say this is his legacy record. And I've narrowed it down to a few choices, but I still have to make that call. And I think there's such a parity between his work at Emerson that it's really hard to say this is the one that you should start with. So, excuse me. So I don't really have a real. Some of those artists can be a little more challenging than others. Again, with Parker, what's his legacy of recording? Is early bebop stuff that sonically most people aren't going to really even be appreciative of because it has a less sound quality being from when it was recorded. Uh, some of his later verse stuff is really accessible and polished, but it doesn't really document who Parker was necessarily. So some of these artists are going to be a little bit challenging to pick up and say this is their legacy record. And then there's even some examples like a guy like Monk. It's probably going to be Brilliant Corners, but that's probably not. It's not my favorite Monk record. So I got to fight my own leanings and my own biases and try to think of what is their legacy record. What's the one thing that's going to be in print by them forever? That everyone's going to always associate with that artist. That's what we're trying to do with that series. So, and then there's some artists like Sonny Rollins where you can make a case for 2 or 3 records easily. Same goes for John Coltrane. So it's fun and it's a little bit objective, but I'm also trying to be fair and saying, I think from a consumer standpoint, this is that title that most people should and will start with. And if you haven't got into them yet, this is a great place to start with them. So anyway, that's it for the Legacy series. We'll get into that again coming up this probably on Saturday or Sunday. I'll make that episode. I hope you enjoyed this one. Get your tone poets. Thank you, Kevin Gray and company. You guys do a great job. Again, Mclean is an interesting figure. And there's days where I really connect with him and really like his abstract abilities. Those are the days where it just doesn't sit with me. And I've taken his records off halfway through before, which there's not very many Blue Notes I can say that about. Cecil Taylor unit structures, that's one. Rarely make it through a side of that. Like I said, it's perfect music for playing if you're throwing furniture down a set of stairs. If that's what you got to do, you're cleaning out this apartment and you want to just be throwing it down, put on unit structures. You will enjoy breaking all that furniture, mirrors, windows, throw it all down that flight of stairs. Unit structures will just fall right down with it. My younger days, I could do that. I could throw down furniture all days. Today I need to sit down and relax. So that's part of it too. Is the music you play is going to create the environment that you live in. And I think that's for me, once I grasp that, partly through being a DJ. You know, how you're really setting a template, you're setting a tone, you're creating a color in the room and the mood that everyone else has to live in. And then, so that's, for me now, it's got really hard to be self-indulgent, throwing something I want or like at people. If I don't feel like they're enjoying it, I have a hard time doing that nowadays. As a kid, I had no problem with that. As a teenager, 20-year-old, 30-year-old. But now that I'm almost 50, it's like I want to embrace people and to bring them in. And that's part of, I think, having a good ear. You know, and if you're going to play music that's really filled with danger and filled with edge and dissonance, it's going to impact the mood of the room and the space that you're in. And for me, life has enough edge. Life has enough complication. Life has enough destruction. Life has enough chaos that I don't need to sit in that musically and feel exhausted by it because I'm already trying to sort out everything else that's going on. And so some soothing, calming music with melody and a groove and a pulse, some soul and spirit. I'd rather feel it in my gut and be like, oh, man, what dude just said kills me. Oh, man, he's playing that trombone or playing that. You know, I mean, you can just feel what some guys just pouring it in, not from a place of ego-driven, look how great I am, but just like, oh, fuck, I can't. This feels so good to get out of my system right now. And that's what I connect with as I've gotten older. It's not the virtuosity of, oh, man, I can't believe how he played that many notes. And once in a while, a guy will get me in that sense. But it's more when a guy has a guttural utterance. He's just like, motherfucker, today's been a shitty fucking day. That's when I'm like, oh, I felt that. See what I'm saying? And jazz for me completely changed. It was a moment. And I've talked about it before. It was a moment when you stop listening to the notes and the composition and the difficult and how brilliant it is, all that intellectual stuff. And I listened to jazz that way for 10 years, trying to be analytical. And then one day it became just about, oh man, what does it make me feel? And it was when something made me feel something, and I recognized that epiphany, like, oh shit, that's kind of what this music really is. It's a music about improvising from your emotion through art. So it's absolutely talking to me about how they feel. That's the whole point of emotional improvising. So instead of me trying to listen to the notes and the mathematics, I'm not hearing anything they're telling me. I'm thinking I'm intellectual by diagnosing it this way. But instead, if I stop listening to the detail and just start feeling the emotional swing and sway of where that player's propulsion is pushing me. And it's a real subtle thing. It's not like you sit there and go trying to decipher it. It's like it can just smack you across the face sometimes when you're not even expecting it. We talked about throat grabbers back last year a lot. We did those episodes. And that's what the throat grabbers were. They were always that moment where a guy just comes in. He's like, motherfucker, my wife's God, I can't stand her right now. And that anger, that joy, that passion, that love, that hate, that fear, that tension, that emotional context is the realest shit about jazz. And all the dissonance in the world can't tell you or say something just as from an honest sense of a guy just expressing, motherfucker, I got this on my chest. And I think it's a real tough thing to explain. It's tough for me to sit here and try to get people to grasp. And you can't just change your ways of listening. But I think one day, every one of us who listens to jazz for a long time will have that moment where something just connects. And it feels different all of a sudden. Because I felt like I connected with that musician on a different level, like they were just speaking to me. And so I feel like I come away from listening to that record going, man, I feel like I got to know Sonny Clark a little bit. I feel like Sonny Clark was telling me something. I feel like Monk was talking about his disenfranchisement. I feel like Sonny Clark was telling me about his frustration and disappointment. I feel like Coltrane was talking to me about his optimism and his hopeful belief that things can be better. I feel like Miles is talking to me about, go sit down, white boy. You can buy my record, but don't talk to me. And when you start to feel players and their personalities and where they come from, again, it's just such a different listening experience. It becomes more of an element of what's on so-and-so's mind today. What kind of a day was that so-and-so having when they made this record? And their personality will help inform that. Some guys make most days a good day. Other guys can make most days a bad day. Some guys can live hardly ever angry. Other guys are angry all the time. And once you get a few impressions and a few moments and epiphanies, and you have a backlog of information of photographs of who they are, their history, their background, their experiences, suddenly hearing what a jazz player is emoting, it's not as hard as you think. I kind of know who this guy is now. I kind of know where Lee Morgan's coming from. I kind of know where Jackie Mclean's coming from. I kind of know where John Coltrane's coming from. So now let's see if we can decipher without trying to analyze. It's not about analyzing. It's just about feeling. That's the key. That's the key. And it's a hard thing to really explain. So I guess just kind of open your empathy when you listen. Approach it from trying to get a feel of, excuse me, I'm working at my brother's print shop, and some of the chemicals have been bothering my lungs, no question. Anyway, I'll wrap it up there. We're approaching 40 minutes here, so again, I can ramble on sometimes forever. Y'all be safe. Have a great day. If you want to support the channel, go to Patreon. Please subscribe. Hit that thumbs up. Hit ring the bell for so you get alerts when there's new episodes of material. We'll talk to you all soon. There's also a cool merchandise store in the description below. All kinds of cool hoodies, t-shirts, coffee mugs, the like. Appreciate you all. We'll talk to you all soon. Peace.